3.
Hello, I'm Bridget McElhenney. Today, I'm in the Flyer TV studio in Kennedy Union on the campus of the University of Dayton to talk to you about a unique opportunity for all of the university's first-year students. The First Year Immersion program is a partnership between the Dayton Performing Arts Alliance Ballet and UD. On April 3rd, first-year students will experience the ballet Romeo and Juliet at the Schuster Theater in downtown Dayton. Students in a number of disciplines are already preparing for the performance by learning about the various aspects of Romeo and Juliet. Among those aspects are the historical facts involving Romeo and Juliet, as well as the development of the ballet as composed by Sergei Prokofiev. Today, I'm joined by the Director of University of Dayton Honors Program, Dr. David Darrow. Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Darrow.
Thank you, Bridget. I appreciate it.
Well, to start things off, as students are preparing for this performance, what are the most important points about Romeo and Juliet, the ballet, that they should be looking out for?
Well, one of the things that I would be excited about, is, besides seeing this great work of art and a great performance, as it no doubt will be, is that looking at a ballet like Romeo and Juliet is an opportunity to sort of take yourself back in time. And while you're sitting there in the theater, imagine what it was like sitting in the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow watching this in the middle of the 1930s, in the middle of what was really a great Soviet experiment, an opportunity where there was a state that was attempting to make a brave new world over in the Soviet Union at the same time that the rest of the world was mired in the midst of the Great Depression. And so if I was sitting there, one of the sort of types of imagination exercises I would do would be to pretend that I was sitting there watching the original performance about 70, 80 years, or 80 years ago. I'm a historian, not a mathematician, so the math's a little difficult.
But so kind of time travel, so it's like you're there and visual it like it's the first time.
Yeah, time travel. And I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind that one of the things that's going on here is that, Prokofiev actually immigrated from the Soviet Union after the revolution with the blessing of a very sort of liberal commissar of enlightenment, Anatoly Lunacharsky. And so Prokofiev left Russia and spent some time in the United States out in San Francisco, spent some time in Paris, composing works on commission, and then also more and more, especially as the economic situation deteriorated, basically giving concerts. And like lots of musicians, being on the road and doing gigs to feed yourself is kind of a drag. And so especially after the Great Depression hit and it became more and more difficult for him to earn a living in the West, the allure of returning to the Soviet Union became much, much more attractive, and the Soviets were trying to attract many of the great Russian artists who had left after 1917 back. And Prokofiev was one of several who did return.
So there's a lot of history you want to keep in mind.
A lot of history you want to keep in mind. I mean, for me, that's part of the cool thing of going to something like a ballet, is that it gives you an opportunity to imagine yourself, since many of these are older pieces of work, although you can certainly see some contemporary dance in Dayton. The Dayton Contemporary Dance Company does great work. But something that's, one of these old sort of standbys from the 20th century, Romeo and Juliet, gives you an opportunity to not only take a sort of a creative imaginary trip watching the dancing, but also sort of an imaginary historical voyage into the past.
Well, besides everything you just mentioned, are there any key historical facts that you would want students to keep in mind watching this? I know you just mentioned a bunch. But.
One of the things that I would also keep in mind is that since Prokofiev found himself in the midst of this great Soviet experiment where single-handedly Comrade Stalin was leading the party in its pursuit to create a world which was free of capitalist oppression, and where the Soviet Union, this workers' paradise, would rise and take its place amongst the great states of the world. There was a certain sort of emphasis on heroism, and the emphasis in the arts was on basically demonstrating acts of heroism and initially happy endings. So One of the interesting things about the ballet was that when it was originally done, it had a happy ending. And of course, if you know how Romeo and Juliet turns out, it's not a particularly happy ending. The happy ending at the first seemed like the right thing to do because it was in line with the sort of emphasis on positive stories and positive outcomes in the arts that was in force in like the first part of the 1930s in the Soviet Union. After about 1936, however, the revolution starts to take a more conservative turn, and we see a revival of Russian nationalist ideas, Russian nationalist symbols, and also sort of a revival of, rather than trying to do something out of the ordinary, like change the ending of a Shakespearean tragedy, to reaffirm the traditional canon of Western literature. And so the ending went back to what it was supposed to be.
So historically, how do you think this work has been upheld over time?
It's been upheld. It's had a lot of endurance, in part because it's Prokofiev, who truly is one of the great composers of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. It's had a lot of endurance because it's based on a Shakespeare story that is pretty well known. I mean, how many movie versions of Romeo and Juliet have there been?
A lot.
Multiple. If the students really want to see Leonardo DiCaprio when he was really, really young, they might look up that version.
I've seen that one.
Yeah. And I think that in itself has had a lot to do with the endurance of the work.
So kind of the media attention just Romeo and Juliet, the play gets.
Correct.
Just the movie, the book.
It's a standard. I mean,
Yeah.
it's something that everybody knows. I remember the first time that I saw the ballet in Moscow, it was sort of looking for something cultural to do in Moscow at the Bolshoi or at the Grand Kremlin Palace, and here was something that was very familiar to me. I didn't have to hesitate and wonder what I was getting into because I knew the story.
Yeah. So from a historical standpoint, after students watch the performance on April 3rd, what do you want them to take away from it?
I want them to take away the idea that great art can be produced in lots of different cultures with lots of different forms of government. And they might want to stop and contemplate for a while. Here was what we now know one of the most oppressive societies in the entire world, while Romeo and Juliet is playing at the ballet. There are black vans pulling up to people's houses and arresting people in the middle of the night in what was known as the Great Terror. And I think it does as well to sit and contemplate these sorts of strange juxtapositions, beauty and evil sort of existing at the same time in the world, past and present.
And I feel like you would hope that they would take away some sort of sense of inspiration as well after seeing just such a work of art.
Yeah, it's beautiful music. I remember the first time that I heard this, I then went on a Prokofiev binge and listened to everything, and then realized that actually his Peter and the Wolf I had heard at a quite young age when I was a little boy.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Just a reminder, Romeo and Juliet will be performed for first-year students on April 3rd at the Schuster Center in downtown Dayton. Thank you for joining us.